Let me welcome you to this seventh installation in this quarterly series that's hosted by the Frank Weinberg Library, Philosophers in the Midst of History. Each year we look at four philosophers, one from the ancient period, one medieval, one early modern, and then one late modern. So this is the modern time, and we're going to look at one of the fathers of not just modernity itself, but modern political philosophy, Thomas Hobbes, who was quite an extraordinary guy. I'm Greg Sadler. I see a lot of new faces, which is always great to see. So I'm you could say, local practicing philosopher. I used to teach in universities, and although I still do a little bit of teaching on the side, I'm primarily in what you could call private practice. And so if you're interested in it, I can tell you more about that later on. But I still do a lot of this sort of intellectual work, and I was really happy to partner with the Frank Weinberg Library because this series focuses on philosophers, and it looks at them, like I said, in the middle of history, in their historical context, and what formed them. So with Thomas Hobbes, there's probably nothing more important than the English Civil War, which was a very, interesting set of events, very dramatic. A king loses his head. You have one of the first totalitarian societies, at least in the West, arising under Cromwell's protectorate. Hobbes is not at the middle of it. He's not an agent, so to speak, but he's reflecting on what's going on. And it's part of a number of other events that go all the way back to the Protestant Reformation. So we'll talk about some of the background of that. Before I go on, if there's any questions at any point or you want to make a comment, I'm perfectly happy to go off topic or talk about things. I can always bring it back to topic. So what I had in mind was to first talk about Hobbes, Europe, and Britain a little bit. Give you kind of the lay of the land, not in terms of maps, but in terms of great developments that had taken place that were forming not just him, but everybody else. The things that everybody was talking about, the things that people were, in many cases, obsessed with, obsessed enough to kill each other over. And then we'll look at Hobbes himself and how his long, over 90 years long life fits into this. And then we'll start focusing in on some of his key ideas. I want to talk about that in sort of two stages. The first stage, I want to talk about his bigger overall project. What was he really about? What was the point to the things that he was writing, at least the ones that weren't just polemical where he got in fights with people, because we'll talk about that as well. He spent a lot of ink getting in very fruitless fights with some people. But he also contributed some really earth-shaking, really, I say that without any hyperbole at all, ideas to modern Europe, things that affect us even today. He's extremely relevant, even in the present time. He does suffer a little bit. This is a bit of a digression, and I'll come back to this later. He does suffer a little bit by having written in 17th century English, which means that as opposed to, say, 17th century French people who can be translated into 21st century English, we're stuck with him with his weird spelling and diction, and so that makes it a little hard to read him, right? But once we get past that terminological stuff, he's really a first-rate thinker. He is as important to modernity as, say, René Descartes or Francis Bacon. I would say that he, more than Niccolo Machiavelli, deserves the title of the father of modern political thought for reasons that we can talk about. So you might say, wow, you must be really a fan of Hobbes. And I'm not, actually. I think that he sort of represents a kind of danger, the way that he thinks about things, that we want to be aware of. But he also sets the problems that we face in politics, all the way down to the present, in a very helpful way. So we'll talk about some of those ideas. So some key aspects about Hobbes, Europe, and particularly the Britain that he lives about 2/3 of his life in. He spends a good bit of time living outside of Britain, in part because of the tumult going on there. So I mentioned the Reformation. By the time that Hobbes is coming on the scene, the Reformation has been going on for a while. And, if you think about your church history, it's not one monolithic thing of, Protestants, Martin Luther getting the ball rolling and then everybody being the Protestant team versus the Catholic team. Instead, think of it as you've got the Catholic team where quite a few people are undercutting each other. You might say that some of them are trying to jockey for team captain position and doing all sorts of skullduggery around that. And then you got the Protestant side where it starts splitting off into all these different groups. So very early on, you have the Lutherans in Germany, and then you have the Anabaptists, many of whom get wiped out early on. And then you have the Reformed, the Calvinist tradition. Then there's spin-offs. England was particularly fertile in producing new sects, new groupings, some of whom didn't actually fit in that well with that. And not fitting in well with the spectrum meant that you didn't have a safe place to live. Because it wasn't just that if you were a Protestant, the Catholics might persecute you, or you might persecute the Catholics. If you were the wrong kind of Protestant in somebody else's territory, you would get persecuted. And if you were somebody like, say, a Quaker, or until they actually took over, a Puritan, well, you were going to get persecuted anywhere you went, just about, except maybe the Netherlands, which is where some of the Congregationalists who would later come here to the United States, before it's the United States, settled for a short time. So there's all this religious conflict that's ongoing. And if you look at who the key players are, especially in England, you have, there's Catholics, right? But they, except for Mary's reign, they're pushed out. Henry VIII, establishes the Church of England. Elizabeth is really able to consolidate it. There's some attempts to try to intervene, actually a lot of attempts, not just on the part of the papacy and the Spanish, but other people as well. They're totally unsuccessful, and so England is, essentially under the Church of England, which was fairly conservative, much like the Lutheran Church was in Germany. They didn't get rid of a lot of things that the older Catholic Church had. So that actually provoked a lot of reaction from more radical Protestants. And so who would those people be in this case? Up in the north, in Scotland, you have the Presbyterians, right? And they are sort of lined up with the churches in Geneva. The Geneva Bible is one of the first English Bibles. It antedates the King James Bible, which we'll talk about shortly. And so there's a whole different branch of the Protestants up in Scotland who don't really go along with the Anglican Church. Then you have the Puritans, and the Puritans are Congregationalists. They are also Calvinists at that time. And that means that they're a minority within England, and they're not being recognized. They're Puritans in part because they say the English church is still far too Catholic. You still have priests, you're still putting stuff on the altars, you still have stained glass, you need to get rid of all that stuff. Now, if you say things like that to people, when they're used to things being a certain way, they might not like it. And in this case, they didn't. And quite often, the Anglican authorities came down pretty hard on the Puritans. You also have other groups, the Baptists, the Quakers, the Friends. They're coming out of this matrix as well as a number of sects that didn't survive. The Diggers, the Levelers, these ones that we read little blurbs about. Generally, the more violent and the more radical you were, the lower your chances were of making it into the next century as a group. Because it was a very violent time. So there's all this religious ferment going on. Then there's also wars between the nations that are kind of tied up with religion, but also tied up with the same old stuff of, who's going to be on top, and, can we disrupt shipping? There were a lot of like switching sides back and forth that took place. Religion often provided a great pretext for attacking somebody or messing around with somebody. Spain and England had been at war for quite a while. The Armada was just one little sort of part of this long war going on between them, which would have some major economic effects. And it wasn't just between nations. There was also a lot of conflict within nations. So, we think of some countries like France as being, devoutly Catholic. Well, there was a civil war that took place within France. And there was a, essentially not global, but pan-European war that had taken place in Germany, that René Descartes would be a soldier in, that devastated half of the German population at one point. So there are these struggles within countries, and that affects England. So, for example, when James marries a Catholic, Charles I marries a Catholic princess, that sets off a lot of alarm bells for people, and they get very upset about that sort of thing. Whereas, today we get upset about all sorts of other things. If we found out that somebody had the wrong sort of political views, and somebody that we think is very important, was being friends with them or promoting them, then we'd get upset about that. Not so much about religious views the way they did back then. Another thing that was going on was a sort of revolution in political order. And what I mean by this was that the nation state, as we know it, as we think about it today, was in formation. And some countries were really on the leading edge of this. Others were kind of sliding into something that wouldn't work for them ultimately. Poland is a great example. Poland will end up getting divided up in part because they can't become a nation state effectively. In order to become a nation state, you not only need some sort of ethnic identity, but you need a bureaucratic apparatus. You need what the French called the noblesse de la robe. And that is, as opposed to the nobles who had aristocratic titles, the people who could run the bureaucratic administration. Something similar was going on in England. In both France and in England, there is also this development of what we could call royal absolutism. This notion, sometimes it's tied in with what we call divine right of kings. There was a lot of talk about that at the time. Even if you stripped away like the divine part of it, there was an argument being made that in order for us to have peace and in order for things to work properly, somebody's got to be in charge, and that person has to have absolute authority. Now, what does that mean? That means that all the other nobles have to be under that person. Somebody who you might think of who really pulled this off well would be, say, Louis XIV, right? And he did so by taking all the nobles off their land and bringing them to the court where they could get in some trouble, right? They could, fool around and get into sexual dalliances and get too drunk and gamble away. But they couldn't, raise armies and cause revolutions. In England, it was, Charles who is very strongly making this argument, Charles who's going to get himself beheaded, about royal absolutism. He's not the only one. James, preceding him, will actually write philosophical tracts about this sort of stuff. Now, what would be the contrast to absolute monarchy? Some sort of representative government. Not representative like we have today, like with our electoral college and all of us getting to vote. I mean, none of us would have gotten to vote back then, right? Unless we were from a noble family or somehow got in somewhere. If we were members of parliament, then we'd get a vote. But there was at least some notion that there should be some people representing the whole of the nation, not just this one guy or perhaps one woman, in the case of Elizabeth, running the show and telling everybody what to do. And so there's a clash going on. And this ties in not just with the religious things that are occurring. The Puritans favored representative government. Anglicans tended to favor the monarchical government. It was also tied in with economic interests. We see the rise of the bourgeoisie, the people who are engaged in commerce, who are engaged in production, in eventually in industrial ways. At first, in less organized ways, and they generate money, and they would like to be represented, and they're not being well represented by these kings who spend a lot of money too. By the way, these kings, their courts demand a lot of money. They also like to get involved in very expensive wars as opposed to much cheaper wars, which the commoners tend to be more in favor of. So you have this entire rise of the commercial class, or the productive class, you might say, ongoing. And that's part of the picture, and I'll add one more big wrinkle to this. Intellectually, we're talking about something else happening at the same time. Not just in terms of changes of religious life and thinking about one's relation to God and how society ought to be organized. There's also the rise of modern science and a new way of looking at things that is being portrayed as sort of the opposite of Aristotle knows everything. Now, the way in which the moderns represented Aristotle was usually pretty unfair to Aristotle. There are a few things on which Aristotle is pretty boneheaded. There's a lot of things on which he was sort of coming up with the best theories he could at the time, some of which seem pretty plausible. And then there's some on which he's actually still pretty good today. There's neo-Aristotelians around who still take some of his stuff very seriously and make good arguments. The moderns, they were often being confronted with people who you might say were sort of like fundamentalists of Aristotle's work. They thought that the answers to every question, you just got to read Aristotle's physics and find the right passage and proof text it, and now you're done. And if it conflicts with what you actually observe too much, so that's too bad for what you observe, right? There were a lot of people like that. There's time servers in every educational institution throughout history, right? It's rare when you get a genuine Aristotle or Socrates or René Descartes or Thomas Hobbes to be your teacher. Much of the time, unfortunately, you're stuck with people who would rather you read the textbook and shut up and get on with the work and graduate, right? There's a good bit of that. Fortunately, I think there's less of that today than there was, say, around Hobbes' time. But he's not the only guy going through this. René Descartes, when he's being educated in the Jesuit institution of La Flèche as a young man, he hates this sort of nonsense too. And so Hobbes is actually going to be formed in a Aristotelian or scholastic, we call it, scholastic way of looking at things, and he'll go away from that later through embracing what he calls the geometric method. But that's going to happen later on in his life. For a long time, that he's just going along with that. This is the way we understand things. And he's going to have a very strong reaction against that. Now, all of these things wind up getting tangled up together. The politics, the religious conflict, the intellectual developments, they're all kind of playing off of each other. And so that's the backdrop leading into Thomas Hobbes' life and the lives of all these other people that he's interacting with, the lives of the people who are going to be engaging in a civil war. So let's talk about some of that and how it comes about and why it has to do, where Hobbes gets into that. And I've given you a timeline, which is somewhat helpful. The Hobbes stuff himself is on one side, and then other things are on the other side. And Hobbes had this great line about, he was born prematurely because his mother was afraid because the Spanish were going to invade. The Spanish Armada, which turned out not to work out, largely because of storms, but also because the English were able to cut them off at certain points. But really, largely because of, things not turning out the way they should weather-wise, was poised to invade England. They had a giant army in the Netherlands, which at that time was owned by Spain. And the reason why, in part, they were doing it was, we're going to reclaim England for the Catholics, but they were also tired of the English messing around with them in the Netherlands. The English kept on, sending, forces and picking off, Spanish ships here and there. So, this is going to settle things once and for all. So imagine that that this gigantic fleet is on its way. There's a gigantic army across the way, and you can see these guys. So Hobbes' mother is pregnant. She has him prematurely, and Hobbes says, "I was born a twin to fear." And that sort of sets the tone for his political theory and his life. Early on, his father is gone. His father is a clergyman, gets in a fight with another clergyman, has to leave town. Fortunately, he's got an uncle who helps to raise him because things were not particularly good for single mothers at the time. Hobbes, studies in Oxford at Magdalen Hall, and there he's studying scholastic philosophy. That's the stuff that they have at the time. He translates Euripides' Medea. This is something that's going to be a feature of his life. We don't really think we don't think that much about it, but he did a lot of translation work over the course of his life. We've lost his translation of the Medea, but we have some of the other ones. Now, around this time, you notice that there's the gunpowder plot. Guy Fawkes Day, we remember. Guy Fawkes was a pretty radical Catholic. They wanted to blow up Parliament. This really brought Catholics into bad repute. Sort of a few bad apples, throw the whole bunch out. So there were a lot more stricter anti-Catholic laws going into play. You notice that around 1610, 1611, two interesting things are happening. So Hobbes has become a tutor for this guy, William Cavendish. William Cavendish, the younger William Cavendish, who's going to go to Parliament, and Hobbes will accompany him while he goes to Parliament. So Hobbes is going to learn about this sort of stuff. And by being a tutor, you became part of the household. You got to participate in all these interesting things that it opened up for you. These people were rich and very well connected. Soon after that, he goes, William goes like any good kid should to travel around Europe to finish his education. Doesn't mean he's studying books. He's living in places and seeing how people behave and meeting people. That's also a very important part of it as well. Hobbes goes with him. Now notice on the world scene what's happening about the same time. They finally finish the authorized King James version of the Bible. Now why is that a big thing? Well, before that, the Reformed Protestants had their own Bible. When you're translating stuff, you can really steer it one way or the other, depending on what you're doing with the Greek and Greek and Hebrew texts in this case. Although they're consulting the Vulgate from time to time, and the Geneva Bible really represented a Reformed point of view. It did not represent the Anglican point of view. So they could quote Scripture to these Anglican divines, and the Anglican divines were kind of at a disadvantage. So what's the best thing to do? They don't get to use that Bible anymore. This is the authorized version. And it was translated by people who had in mind the agenda of the Church of England, which is the agenda of the King of England, James. King of England and Scotland, both combined. The irony of it, and there's a little bit of a digression, is that here in the United States, we tend to associate the King James Version with what we could call low church Protestants, right? So where there's not a lot of institutional structure, very conservative. It's exactly those sort of people that the King James Bible was translated to marginalize, to cut off. But it got embraced by them here. in kind of an interesting twist. So now you notice that Cavendish becomes a member of Parliament. Hobbes accompanies him there. Eventually, he winds up on the outs because William Cavendish Sr. dies of the plague, something that you could very well die of back then. And the wife and widow says, well, we don't need you anymore. So Hobbes, fortunately, finds some new work. He becomes a tutor to Gervase Clifton, travels to Paris with him. And doing all these sorts of things, Hobbes notice he's getting close to 40 years old by this time. He's developing contacts. He's seeing the world. He's not actually producing a lot of work at this time. A lot of what he's going to do is much later in life, as opposed to quite a few of the other philosophers who were showing great promise early on. Meanwhile, all of this is happening. Things are getting worse and worse in England. The Parliament adopts this petition of right. They want to constrain the powers of the English king. They want to no longer allow him to do this, billet troops on their property, to establish, certain kinds of taxes. Parliament is getting into a clash. And what you've got here are two parties that are not going to back down. Parliament wants representative government. The king wants everyone else to shut up and do what he tells them to do, because he's the king. The Duke of Buckingham winds up getting assassinated. Buckingham is a very close friend of the king. Charles opens the Parliament, gets into a clash with the Parliament over taxes. He wants to start another war. He wants money for it, and they won't do it. So now he starts this long period of ruling without Parliament. It's kind of similar to what happens in our government when we talk about gridlock. When one political party holds the executive branch and the other political party dominates the legislative branch. We've seen quite a lot of that over the last, several decades. How do you do that? Well, we talked today about executive orders, and there's a lot of debate. Usually, both sides are okay with executive orders when their side's in charge, and then they're totally against it when the other side is in charge, right? That's similar to ruling without Parliament for an English king. And you notice that a lot of the stuff is about the same kind of issues. Who should be in charge? Who gets to decide where the money goes? Who gets to decide how much money we're going to draw? What's the money going to be used for? All of these sorts of things. Charles keeps pushing and pushing and pushing. He appoints this guy Laud to be Archbishop of Canterbury. That would be sort of like today. Once you're president, you pick somebody for some important office, like a Supreme Court justice or Secretary of State or something with real power, and you push in somebody who's like super hardcore ideology on your side, but also very slick, very, very, a very good talker. And the parliamentarians, they don't like that. So things are going back and forth. Meanwhile, Hobbes himself, he's had sort of a revolution of thought. He came across Euclid. And Euclid, of course, we know the elements of geometry. He was one of the classic geometricians. Part of what's really key to early modern philosophy is this notion that philosophy, and they don't just mean philosophy in the sense that we study it today in philosophy departments, but philosophy in a very broad sense, including psychology, including political science, including physics, including the study of the entire natural world, should all be modeled after mathematical ways of doing things, mathematical or geometrical. You begin with axioms. Maybe you get those from observation or something like that, but you begin with axioms and then you rigorously and deductively argue from those. This is a very different approach, and that's what you see Hobbes doing, for instance, in Leviathan. He's adopting a geometric method as far as he understands it. It's not completely clear that Hobbes always had the greatest grasp, although he was a tutor in mathematics, but it's not always clear that Hobbes had the greatest grasp on exactly what was going on with this. Eventually he becomes tutor to another William Cavendish young William Cavendish. He resumes his role in the family, returns to England. He's going to have a couple more trips. He goes back to France, meets this guy, Marin Mersenne, who, if you don't know about him, he's a really interesting fellow. He didn't produce a lot of work himself, but he was sort of the connector of Paris at that time. He's the guy who makes René Descartes' career. He connects people up together. He's the guy who brings everybody in. Nowadays we call this networking, right? Mm-hmm. He is the master networker. And he's very generous about it. He's like, you're doing this stuff with optics over here? Well, that guy over there, he's also interested in that. Let me introduce you to him. And he's doing this by letters. He's doing this with personal introductions. Very, very interesting. Hobbes meets all these big movers and shakers in Paris. He also visits Florence. And now things are coming to a head by the late 1630s. Charles tries to force the Scots to use the Anglican prayer book. He wants a unified kingdom. The Scots refuse. He raises an army, and that costs a lot of money. By 1640, Charles needs to, in order to keep going on with these things, needs to get some taxes passed. So there's the short parliament, which he can't get along with and dismisses, and then things start to get out of hand. And what's called the Long Parliament gets convened. And by now the parliamentarians have learned their lesson about dealing with this king. Don't let him be the only person to call the agenda. And things are already out of hand, but they start to get more and more and more out of hand. And eventually they wind up in 1642 in full civil war between the Royalists, the people who are supporting the king, and the parliamentarians. And interestingly, scholars have done this sort of work, demographic work. They've looked at who went for who, right? So there are certain areas like the north of England, they tended to be Royalist. Other rural areas, those usually were Royalist. The cathedral cities, interestingly, went parliamentarian. The commercial centers, parliamentarian as well. And so you've got a social clash as well as a religious clash and a political clash going on. Meanwhile, Hobbes himself is continuing on in Paris. He gets involved with Descartes, and Descartes is really one of the main people, him and Galileo, involved with the new modern philosophy. He contributes some objections to Descartes' meditations. He writes one of his early important works, the De Cive, on the citizen. It's a work of political philosophy. He doesn't publish it quite yet. He starts to contribute to other things. At the same time, while he's living in Paris, the Royalists who are starting to lose, they're heading to Paris as well. Hobbes has already got a lot of connections with people of that persuasion. And, he himself does believe in a strong, monarchical government. He holds out the possibility you could have a democracy. Probably not going to work, but you could do it. You could even have an aristocracy. That's probably not going to work. Monarchy is really the way to go. So he's sympathetic to them. But, more and more of them are coming in. He's getting involved in their circles. Finally, 1645, Charles is decisively defeated. He's taken prisoner. He has a brief escape in 1647. And by 1649, he is tried and executed. And they switch to a commonwealth. Oliver Cromwell is the ruler of England. And it's essentially, something like a totalitarian state in the making going on. Meanwhile, you notice that Hobbes becomes tutor to the younger Charles, the son of the king, Prince of Wales. And he's his tutor in mathematics, actually. He begins composing the work that he's best known for, Leviathan, and rightly so. Leviathan is the most important thing that Hobbes ever wrote. Leviathan gets finished in 1650, gets published in 1651. It draws a lot of receptive attention from some quarters. It also draws a lot of criticism. Interestingly, some of the criticism is from the Royalists. And some of the Royalists are so upset with Hobbes that they want to kill him. So he actually leaves Paris and goes back to England. And he affirms that he will live under the Republican government. He won't get involved in politics at all. So this is really, almost like an exile for him, an exile within his own country. Isn't that kind of an interesting thought right there? He also starts getting involved in controversies with people. Some of these are sort of on point. Some of these are less on point. There's a guy, Bishop John Bramall, and he attacks Hobbes on a number of different points. The political theory, Hobbes's view on mechanism and materialism, and free will and necessity and stuff like that. Hobbes is perfectly willing to spar with him and fight it out in the press. They write stuff back and forth and back and forth. Hobbes also gets himself involved in some controversies over mathematical proofs of squaring the circle. Clearly, Hobbes is wrong on this stuff. But he gets involved with this guy, Wallace, and they write tract after tract after tract after tract. That's not very important as far as Hobbes scholarship goes, right? What is really important is Leviathan and these other political treatises that he's writing. So he's got the De Cive that he's written. The translation of it appears in 1651. He writes De Corpore, which is about the body, his sort of materialist, mechanistic viewpoint on things, and then finally De Homine, on human being. And these are sort of a trilogy that could be envisioned to be something like a new textbook. This was something also at the time that I should mention. Textbooks, we fight about textbooks now, right? And we tend to fight about textbooks here in the United States mainly in terms of science and social studies, right? Or history. Who gets represented in the histories, and are we going to teach theory of evolution? Are we going to teach intelligent design along with it? Those sorts of things, right? The textbooks that these guys have in mind are the textbooks that will be used in the universities. Because, what we now understand to be K through 12 education is not public at that time for the most part. You can send your kid off or they go to tutors. What really mattered was universities. And whoever could sort of control the philosophical textbooks would determine the mindset of people who are in there. So there's scholastic textbooks, like Aristotle's Physics is a textbook. Or there might be commentaries on it. René Descartes, when he is writing his Principles of Philosophy, that's supposed to be a textbook that university students would use. John Locke's essay winds up becoming a textbook for people to use. Hobbes is writing things that could be textbooks. All sorts of people are doing this. Why is that so important? Because if you control the basic mindset and principles that people are using, you determine where all the other studies are going to go. Because remember, what are universities fundamentally about at this time? It's not about producing people that go to business school and get an MBA. That's like stuff that happened in the 20th century, the late 20th century. The three traditional professions that people were being prepared for in university: theology, law, medicine. Philosophy is an important part of that. I mean, eventually they're going to branch out into other things. But these are supposed to be preparing people to engage in public life. So by providing the textbook, you, in a way, set the agenda. And this will be a part of Hobbes' ideas later on. You notice that as things go on, eventually the monarchy is restored. And notice who it's restored with. the same guy who Hobbes tutored. So Hobbes now has a place for life. He can go to the court. The king used to call him his old bear. Apparently Hobbes was in pretty good shape. We were talking about this a little bit before. One of the ways that Hobbes claimed that he stayed in shape was by singing in his room by himself. So we're kind of speculating. I wonder what kind of songs, how loud he was singing these because, in order to actually get exercise from it. Maybe he was dancing. Who knows? But Hobbes is now, sort of made it. And he does publish a few other things. He publishes some translations of Homer. He also publishes an autobiography in Latin. Leviathan gets translated into Latin. That is a sign that it's being recognized as centrally important. Because if you really want to be taken seriously at that time, even all the way up to the early 1800s, you need to be in Latin. Because that can be read universally across Europe. In a way, Hobbes is going the opposite direction of Descartes. Descartes' meditations are written in Latin first. Descartes writes them in Latin, doesn't even translate them into French himself. Has another guy do the translation and says, good enough. And in some cases, it's a little bit paraphrastic. It's not exactly what the Latin text says. And Hobbes is going the other way. Leviathan has made it because it's been translated into Latin. Behemoth is the companion piece to Leviathan. These are two legendary beasts in the Bible, in the book of Job, right? The Leviathan in the sea, the behemoth on land. Behemoth is a history of what took place in England and how everything went south, how everything fell apart, how the Commonwealth, before, not actually called the Commonwealth, the monarchy, how that broke down and got replaced by forces that, in Hobbes' view, were more and more inimical to public safety and to good politics. It doesn't get published. The reason why it doesn't get published while Hobbes is still around is because the king suggests to him that you shouldn't publish this. It does afterwards. And it's a really interesting piece. Very few people read it. But if you want to see how Hobbes' theory in Leviathan gets translated into, some sort of real conditions, that's the book to read. And you can see similar dynamics of social disorder and breakdown by factionalization happening throughout history. So that's a good lead-in. Actually, before I talk about Hobbes' ideas, I've been talking at you for a long time. And nobody's asked any questions, which is very nice, but I'm sure you guys must have some questions or comments, so I should take a break. Yeah?
One of the things in my understanding of history, I'm not a historian, but a number of things that impact culture, view of the material world, and the drive for religion and science to understand life as the material world affects you. We think of the grasses and its impact on society going back to biblical days, etc. That kind of thing. Do you have any idea? Because what I'm noticing is that the technology, the computer, for example, is impacting on the culture. It took me a long time to enter the IT world. But
you're almost dragged into it whether you like it or not, right?
Yeah, I have no choice.
Yeah.
Do you have any comments throughout history how the philosophy might have been impacted by technological advances?
Oh,
We're not good at predicting the impact of a wheel when the wheel was invented, and how agriculture, the ability to produce surplus food, affected, etc., that kind of thing.
So I'll say two things right off the bat. One is that the introduction of of technology, once it becomes pervasive enough, provides sort of imagery and metaphors that can be used by philosophers, but also by other people too. You see this in literature too, right? So in the early modern period, for example, with Hobbes, I mentioned that he has a materialist conception of things, right? So he thinks everything is material. Even God, he thinks, is material, which is kind of hard to explain, but he spends the last 2 books of Leviathan basically trying to do that with a exegesis of Scripture that nobody buys, even at the time. Now, it's also a mechanistic conception of nature and of the human being. So he gets very detailed about this, and he talks about, like, when we're talking about our ideas and how we get them, he conceives of the nerves as something like, pulleys and gears. And I mean, we know that that's not the case, but he's sort of trying to work with the best scientific conception he has at the time of how this could be the case. He sees animals as being just pure machines. We are machines. Now, where did that come from? Well, it's because they're actually developing technology and machinery, and people like him can look at it day after day. Would that have been possible, say, in the 1200s? Probably not. So there's things like that. The ways in which people imagine things, and then the other thing is. Yeah, you're right. So the adoption of the wheel facilitating travel, or the developments with agriculture. I mean, there's the first getting together in groups. I mean, by the time that we're talking about philosophy, we're talking about fairly developed societies, but there's agricultural developments going on that are changing what's a profitable crop and what's not a profitable crop. The other thing is too, they're in contact with the new world by now. So new foodstuffs are coming over and influencing things. There's a vast influx of wealth into Europe as well. All of that is possible because of development of nautical technology and being able to just move things. That opens up new possibilities for philosophers to do things differently. There's greater space for thinking, you could say. And when it comes to politics, I guess in a way, there's more to fight over, right? The more sheer wealth that you're developing, there's more to fight over. Now, the computer thing is a really interesting thing to bring up, because the changes that have happened just in our lifetime are so fast compared to the rate of social change, say, back in Thomas Hobbes' time, right? Things took longer to get implemented. I mean, consider this iPhone. 10 years ago, this was considered almost utopian, revolutionary kind of stuff. And the iPhones that people had back then didn't have anything close to the capacity. This one's like 4 years old, so it's out of date. But the ones that they had 10 years ago were much less powerful than this. And if you were to show this to somebody from, say, 2000, they'd be like, well, what the hell is this? There's a nice piece of glass here. I don't know what you've got in your hand. There's been so much, there's philosophers who actually theorize about this in terms of speed. There's one who's got a great phrase. He's dead, unfortunately, Odo Macquart. Tachogenic unworldliness, he called it. This feeling like we don't really know where the hell we are anymore because the world has changed so much in just a few decades. It's sped up so much,
Now, one of the things, right, you used the word nation.
Oh, yeah.
During the time that you're talking about, nation meant something much different than it is today.
Yeah.
Today it includes territory, formed for whatever reason.
Well, it's interesting.
That's just one more.
Yeah.
That's a change because of our mobility. And we're able to define where we come from by seeing what's outside the territory.
Yeah, and we have better maps, too.
Yeah.
James. So James VI of Scotland, who becomes James I of Scotland and England, wants to call himself James of Great Britain, and Parliament doesn't like that. They don't want to have it recognized as being one nation. And he makes a geographical argument about this, saying, look, it's one island. Obviously we're meant to be one political community. And they're like, no. There's Scotland, there's England. Also, there's Wales too. But by then they're subjugated. So yeah, and you think about France, right? It took a long time for France. There's actually a great book by Eugen Weber, great historian, who is called Peasants into Frenchmen, and it's sort of tracing out the development of the idea of a French nation. He says you really don't have much of that until the 1800s, you do in Paris, right? Because they're the ones who control everything, but you don't in the back areas. So I think you're right about that. And the development of, again, I carry around a map with me now everywhere I go that can tell me where I am on the map. When we had maps before, like the road atlas, you had to actually have some idea where the hell you were, right? Or it wasn't any good to you, Are you still in Wisconsin, or have you crossed over into Illinois? What highway are you on? You'd have to actually look for signs to be able to tell where you are. And now the technology. So my kids, who've grown up with this, I don't think they look at paper maps. I don't think they know how to. I don't think they're doing that in school. I couldn't tell. They know how to use the technology, but they don't really, they don't have the same relationship with it that we do, who grew up with paper maps, and for whom this is sort of a derivative reality. For them, this is the reality, Yeah, so great question. Well, let me talk about some of Hobbes' ideas, and some of these may, be fascinating for you, and some of them may be repugnant for you, and you may have some reactions against them. Before I do that, I said that I wanted to talk about his general project. So his general project does tie in with this historical development. Hobbes wants to have in his view, totally scientific explanation of everything, from where our ideas come from, to how matter interacts, to what God would be. Nobody pays any attention to that part of his work anymore, and especially to political and ethical matters within societies that we actually live in. So here's some of his key ideas. Oh, by the way, why do you want to have a completely scientific account? Is it just for the sake of doing science, because you love science? No, it's very practical, because this is the only thing that is going to allow us to live in peace and to enjoy, a life free of fear, a life where we can develop, through technology, our potentials and enjoy, the fruits of our labors. If we don't have a completely scientific account, and we're relying on something like Aristotle, or what some Puritan divine says, or whatever wild whim some king has, then we're really screwed. We're going to be relying on, it's sort of like garbage in, garbage out for computers. If we start with bad data and bad theories, we're just going to mess things up. So he's hoping to provide the blueprint for social harmony by providing this scientific account. Now, I gave you a handout, which is quite lengthy, and I don't expect anybody to look at it all right now. This is something I provide my students with when I teach Hobbes, and it's about his theory of human conflict. And he talks about human beings as existing in kind of like we can call it an abstract state of nature. Imagine that we don't have any governing body, we don't have anyone setting the rules, and sort of like on people. That Survivor show, they're on the island. Imagine that there's no cameras anymore, or judges coming in, and everybody can do what they want to do. Hobbes says, well, people in those sort of situations are going to kill each other. And we are the most dangerous animal. Why? Because we don't just kill each other over things like who gets the meat or who gets to mate or things like that. We have even better reasons to kill each other that go way beyond that. So there's what he calls competition, right? We're going to compete over the same kinds of resources: land, access to fertile areas where we can farm our sheep, or maybe a river that we like. We might compete over mates. We might compete over whatever. And as a matter of fact, if I do well and I've got stuff and you don't have it, you're going to want to take it from me. This is a natural desire, according to Hobbes. So if my farmland is better than yours, then you're going to want to take my farmland and the products. Now this leads to the second reason for human conflict. So there's not only competition, but I can predict that there will be competition. So that means that if I know that my land is better than your land, I know that you sooner or later, even though you smile at me and you wave, hey neighbor, sooner or later you're going to try to kill me so you can take my land. So the rational thing to do, given that there's no government or anything like that, is that I kill you before you kill me. I preemptively attack you. Now, you of course can also think, well, that guy sees that my land isn't as good, and he's already thinking that I might attack him, so he's probably going to attack me. So I better attack him first. Now you notice that things are just sort of escalating, right? Everybody's now looking for an opportunity. The third thing, Hobbes says that we will get into conflict beyond all of that over vanity. He says for a trifle, over a smile or a lack of a smile, over somebody being laughed at. We want to be valued by the other people. It's not just enough that they keep their hands off of our stuff. We want them to feel a certain way about us, and we're willing to engage in conflict with them about that. So this makes us really, really dangerous, right? Because if you know that your neighbor, let's say that your neighbor, you manage to equalize, everyone's got the same amount of grain, and you come to some sort of decision. Look, you're not going to cross over to my territory because as soon as I see you coming, I'm going to kill you, and I won't do that with yours. Hobbes says you can still fight over vanity, over whose sports team is better, whose house looks prettier, or things like that. So this makes us incredibly dangerous. And this means that at any given time, if we're being rational, unless there's something to keep us in check, we always have to suspect everybody. Because, we would do the same. This is Hobbes' reasoning. Now, of course, this is coming out of a situation in which people are, in fact, acting like that. Civil wars are taking place. People are killing each other, sometimes over religion, sometimes using religion as a pretext, sometimes, just because they like the other guy's boots and they're going to take them. So there's a lot of this going on. Hobbes is writing in a situation where this kind of makes sense. So that's one key idea. I mentioned a state of nature. Hobbes talks about, when you're lacking some sort of stable government, you're in what he calls a state of nature. And there's a lot of discussion about just how serious is he about this. Does he think that there really is a state where there's no governance whatsoever? My view is, no, that's not actually the case. I actually have a paper where I distinguished 5 different states of nature that Hobbes talks about. What he's really concerned with, though, is the breakdown of social order. He thinks that, like in a society like ours, imagine tomorrow that we have some kind of natural disaster. And somehow, let's just take Mequon, right? Somehow Mequon gets cut off from the rest of the world. I don't know how it happens. Maybe, some perfect earthquake that goes along the city lines or something like that. And let's also assume, since we're being far-fetched here, we can imagine whatever we like, every police person dies. All of the officers of the court die. There's some sort of virus that goes out, some sort of occupational virus. Who else would we have to take out of the thing? The firefighters we could leave around. The teachers, I suppose, so long as they're not too prescriptive, right? Now, there's a couple shopping centers, so we've got food. Not a lot of farming going on here in Mequon anymore, not like the old days, right? So it's not really sustainable for all of us people. What would we do in the supermarkets? How would we behave? Okay, so and what would that? I mean, we each go and yeah. So we would get into conflict. If I see you being a particularly successful looter, maybe I don't even have to do all the looting. I just wait until you get out of the store with like a whole bag of cans, and then bop you on the head. And so Hobbes thinks that this is our natural condition. Now he's not embracing this. He's not saying this is a good thing. The goal is, how do we get out of this? And this is where he proposes. He's one of the first explicit theorists of this. He proposes a social contract. He says, we're reasonable creatures. Not only can we use our reason to predict, when can I get the drop on that guy? Or is that guy trying to kill me or something like that? We can also use reason to see that, if we could actually get along, things would be a lot smoother. We wouldn't have to devote so much time and attention and anxiety to worrying about what the other guy does. If I do manage to grow a crop, I don't have to worry about somebody else taking it away from me. Wouldn't that be nice? Now, that can only work if I'm not the only person willing to do it. If I'm willing to do it, but you're not willing to do it, then I'm what we call these days a sucker, right? And it doesn't make sense to be a sucker. So if I can get you to agree, and you can get me to agree, and we all do this together, then we can start working out some ways to live together. And it's sort of like what goes on when people are roommates, right? Who's going to wash the dishes? Who's going to clean the toilets? These sorts of things. People work these out over time, and they often do so by saying, "Isn't it better for all of us if we don't eat each other's food that's been labeled in the common refrigerator, or if you mess up the dishes, do the dishes, right?" And sometimes there's some guy who doesn't want to do the dishes, and then they all pile in on him, right? Well, that's what Hobbes says ought to happen. You probably need somebody who's really powerful to be able to do that. And so, these laws of nature that he suggests, they tell us things like, we should, form, communities and appoint somebody to be in charge and give that person enough power to punish us if we step out of line. But we should also do stuff like nobody should mess with anybody else just to mess with them, right? Nobody should give offense to other people. If somebody's waving a white flag, don't shoot that guy. That's actually one of his rules. And he comes up with a whole bunch of interesting rules, what he calls the laws of nature. Now, what's needed in this, and this is another key idea, I mentioned there's got to be somebody in charge. Hobbes calls that person the sovereign. And, we have sovereigns, right? We have a president. If we're working in a corporation, there's kind of a sovereign, the CEO. Some of them are kind of weak. Some of them are very strong. I suppose in a school, it would be the principal or the superintendent or whoever, right? Somebody's ultimately in charge. Here's where it gets really interesting. And here's where a lot of people disagree with Hobbes. Hobbes says that the sovereign must have unquestioned authority. The sovereign must be absolute, because if you dilute it in any way, sooner or later, everybody's trying to go back to the state of nature. Everybody's trying to get their own little thing. So there shouldn't be any checks on the power of the sovereign. He or she ought to be totally in charge. If they decide that they want to kill you, you have the opportunity to resist, and it's okay for you to do that. Just don't expect it to work. And quite frankly, you're actually a rebel and wrong by doing that, in Hobbes' view, because you're disrupting the social order. The sovereign, think of the sovereign as he's got this picture, right, of a giant man composed of other men, and it's got both the mitre and the sword. And imagine the sovereign is looking down, and that guy is causing trouble. Whap! Cut him in half. That's what it's doing. Hobbes goes even further with this. And this is where we might have some problems with this notion of absolute sovereignty already. Hobbes goes further. Not only should the sovereign have what we nowadays call a complete monopoly of force, bless you, and sort of unquestioned authority, they should control the intellectual life of the nation. There shouldn't be... Hobbes gets very specific about this. When it comes to the civil law, those guys who are like reading Cicero and Aristotle, get rid of them. Those preachers who are preaching this and that goes against the God, get rid of them too. If they tell them they have to shut up, first of all, and burn those books, and if they won't stop, you got to kill them. The sovereign, this is where it starts to become something like a totalitarian society. There can only be one point of view. Other people can have other points of view so long as they don't conflict with the point of view of the sovereign. And that point of view includes the sovereign is always right, even when they're going against things. The only thing that can really be bad on the part of a sovereign is not keeping the peace. And Hobbes himself is so afraid of what happens in civil war. He's very thoughtful about this. It's not just that people fight with each other. The entire moral fabric of a society gets torn apart. Words stop meaning what they used to mean, like justice or fidelity. When you have a real civil war, that's part of the damage that gets done. Especially if it goes on for years and years and years. And Hobbes is very attuned to that. So we might say that his diagnosis of these kinds of situations is dead on, and then perhaps disagree with his remedy for them, this absolute sovereignty backed by complete control over ideas. But notice, I said that his ideas are still very timely. This is some of the things that people advocate today. The national security state has to be unchecked. Otherwise, we're not safe. There are some ideas that are just too dangerous. We have to squash them. They can't be in the public marketplace of ideas. Those who say those sorts of things, we've got to find some ways to silence them. And this is not exactly... for Hobbes, it would be the sovereign doing that. We often just make it, somebody ought to do something. But people are saying stuff like this. And they're not just saying it, of course, here. It gets said in all places all over the world. When we see failed states in different parts of the world where a civil war has taken place and everybody's fighting against everybody, that's a Hobbesian situation. And if we have a warlord who comes to the fore and manages to impose power, and people are saying, well, it's better that than discord, like, say, in Syria with Assad, better to have him in place than to have things breaking down. Or Saddam Hussein, people were saying that about him. Horrific dictator who was doing terrible things to his own people, but people were saying, well, it's better than everybody being at everybody's throats. So those are Hobbesian situations too. He helps us understand what's going on. That's kind of a good place to close this, and then take any discussion or questions. I've thrown a lot of ideas at you. Yeah.
Where does religion fit into all of this?
We can talk about it like in Hobbes's actual case, right? Hobbes is devoted to the Church of England because that's what the English have, and all those other preachers basically ought to be silenced or brought in. He's sort of more absolutist than the Anglicans, because the Anglicans are usually a lot, they're more lax in that way. They're like, so long as you're not preaching revolution, it's pretty okay. When you start doing that, now you're really a problem. So long as, of course, you're not Catholic too. Hobbes lays down, he's got discussions in the same thing where he's talking about the civil law, about what preachers ought to be able to say. And the entire second half of Leviathan is devoted to his theology, which nobody buys. Nobody at the time bought. And he's got all these biblical passages that he's using to back up his views. Those are in books 3 and 4 of Leviathan, which very few people read. I've read them. Really interesting stuff. I can't imagine ever trying to teach them to students. So now, could you do without religion? Hobbes thinks, yeah, you could. But so long as religion's on the scene, there has to be one religion that dominates. And any other point of view, insofar as it conflicts with that, has to be silenced. Because otherwise...
It's subject to the sovereign.
Yeah. And the sovereign if the sovereign decided tomorrow, we're all going to become Buddhists, sovereign decides. So this actually goes to the issue of, well, why did the Royalists, why didn't they like Hobbes? Because the implications of Hobbes' point of view isn't that the Stuart dynasty is the legitimate dynasty. Whoever happens to be in power, they're the legitimate dynasty. So long as they can keep the peace, it's okay. So divine right of kings, not needed anymore. It's a very modern way of looking at things. Whoever can enforce the social contract and keep peace and order in a very effective way deserves to be in power. And they ought to be backed up in whatever way possible. Well, a fairly corrupt dynasty like that of Charles, spending money left and right on all sorts of things, that's not They could read between the lines and see that Hobbes is really not their ally,
Separation would strike me, what I read women, is the separation of what we call the secular world and religious world.
Yeah.
Was not as defined as it is that we've grown up with.
Yeah.
Here in the United States. Go to Sweden, the government still supports the
Lutheran Church. Yeah.
But nobody
goes.
Right.
And they even have like the...
So
yeah.
The concept of separation is one that we grew up with,
Yeah.
Of faith, secular world, that kind of thing. What is also striking with Hobbes is that if things are left alone, you get disorder. That's the idea physically of entropy.
Yeah. True.
Things will move to disorder from order. So you have to spend energy to keep order, which from a physics standpoint, that's true.
Yeah. And he does see it as essentially physics, like building up from the bottom through the human body and our minds. And yeah.
Religion in the area of Hobbes, my impression, involves Descartes. Darwin was a very religious man. He refused to publish his book because he's worried about what the church would say about it, that I read about it, kind of thing.
Well, Darwin's much later.
He was a very good observer of the natural world and the limitation of evolution that he came up with. So, and then nationhood, as I think, was defined in today's term because of technology as well as other things. It also defines area as well as culture and whatever it might be. That leaves me with a lot of questions.
Okay.
That's on here.
Well, that's a lot. Yeah, so religion could act as a unifying force, right? But even when it was, it could also act as a thing that you could use opportunistically. So even like in Catholic countries where there's this sort of veneer of, hey, we're all on the same page, not like those Protestants over there. There was a lot of, competing and jockeying for like who would be in charge. There's, like a big issue was, is the French church independent of, can the French church kind of decide its own stuff as opposed to the larger church? They call this Gallicanism. And what you see is, so you talked about, Hobbes thought that there was, the physics underlay everything, and then you get, animal motion, and then you get, minds like ours. And if you could understand all this stuff, you would see why people do things the way they do, what their reasoning processes are, and how to modify them. So you talk about, like, how do you keep things from breaking down into entropy? You need some very strong structures to keep things in place. And here's where the religion part comes in, and also, other things. Once you've got a structure in place, you do not want people monkeying around with those structures, making tweaks here and there, unless they're the person who's authorized to do so, right, or a deputy of that person. Because as soon as they start doing that, it's like you can break off a part of the mechanism, and now that can become independent over here, and you start getting the breakdown with entropy. Hobbes does really think that when things get terrible, we really are in a state of war of all against all. That's kind of a limit condition, and things have to go a long way to reach that, but he thinks that we can see that happen in, like, say, in a couple decades of social conflict. Yeah.
So with regard to religion, he thinks it's the strength of the structure. Is that correct? In other words, he would not really put any credence into the Ten Commandments and thou shalt not kill and these things being, explained, by the church to the people and the people accepting them and living by that code, as opposed to, we have armies behind us.
Well, I mean, if you look at his laws of nature that we're supposed to be, any reasonable being should be able to derive these as so the norms that we would live in, provided we have somebody to keep the peace. A lot of the Decalogue is in there. Respect for property, thou shalt not steal. Murder, right? Even thou shalt not bear false witness. The prohibition against lying, misrepresenting things. I think Hobbes thinks that, and there's a lot of other thinkers who think this, the Decalogue could be, even Thomas Aquinas saw this. The Decalogue could be understood in terms of the natural law, in terms of how reasonable beings, if they're going to live together, ought to comport themselves towards each other. It gets more dicey when you get to, like, the early parts, like, well, why do you have to honor your mother and father? Interestingly, the ancients, when they're interpreting that, they tended to put that on the side of the divine, the precepts that had to do with the divine, because parents were kind of semi-divine. I don't think anybody in our time probably thinks that, right? And so where did that drop out of the picture? Probably in modernity. But having not taking the Lord's name in vain, Hobbes doesn't really worry so much about things like that, except insofar as it could offend somebody. So I guess he would say, look, if the sovereign likes the Decalogue, you're stuck with the Decalogue. If the sovereign likes something else, you're stuck with that. Which is interesting, because then, well, what do you do if you've got a sovereign and they die, and now the succession takes place, and let's say their kid is a total atheist? What do you do? You're kind of stuck with them. I think that's one of the problematic parts of his theory. Yeah. Yeah. Did you have a question, or? Oh, okay. Are there any other questions or comments, or?
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'm always happy to see people. Ideally, now you all go and read Leviathan.
Right. Ideally.
I can't enforce it, of course, because I'm not the sovereign.
Because you're not the sovereign. But thank you for the historical structure.
You're very welcome.
It doesn't happen in a vacuum. That helps a lot more.
Yeah.
Thank you.